Okay, hi everyone. My name is Szymon Ozimek, and the title of my presentation is Docs as Code at Atlassian, JIRA API documentation. So let's get into it. First, a quick look at the agenda. Uh, okay, now let's get to the introduction. First, a few words about me. I joined Atlassian early last year, but overall, I've worked as a technical writer for about 8 years now. I'm based in Warsaw, in Poland. I'm part of the Atlassian ecosystem platform team. What the team does is our aim is to enable our partners, so other software developers, to extend the Atlassian platform with apps. The company Atlassian, if you haven't heard of it, was founded in 2002 in Australia, and you might be familiar with a few of our products such as Jira, Confluence, and Trello. Now, what is this presentation going to be about? So the subject is API Dev Docs, and more specifically, the Docs as Code paradigm put into practice. And I'm going to be giving this from my perspective, which is that of a technical writer or a content designer in the Jira Cloud org. I'll be talking about the process, the tools, and the ideas behind the whole thing. This should be fairly high level, so I'll do my best not to get too far into the weeds. And all this should take about 20 minutes with 5 minutes left for Q&A at the end. All right, moving on. Another look at the agenda, and the next item we have is how we work. Before we get into more detail, have a quick look at this overview. And don't worry, I will be getting into more detail as we progress, and you will get a chance to see the slide again at the end. Anyway, how we work. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the fact that we have docs in our DOD, meaning our definition of done. So much like with tests, our sprint definition of done includes doc coverage. So nothing is done until it has been documented. Why? Well, we produce APIs mostly, and an API is essentially useless to developers without proper documentation. I'm happy to say that we have managed to build a fairly good culture of documentation engineering, and this actually works in practice. The second thing about content design and technical writing is that here at Atlassian, this is a dedicated craft. And what does that mean? Uh, Essentially, this means that you have defined growth paths and proficiency levels for that specific type of job. This helps give it legitimacy and make people treat documentation with the proper respect I think it deserves. Uh, Another benefit of that is, since we have these growth paths and everything, is that we have dedicated training and even mentoring for junior content designers. In fact, I contribute to the craft as a mentor myself. Overall, doing all this, I think, helps us take documentation more seriously and fight the assumption I'm showing you here on the slide, meaning that technical writing documentation actually does contribute value rather than just generating costs and delays. Moving on, another important part of how we work is that content designers, or CDs, are a part of the pull request or merge request, whatever you want to call it, the pull request flow. Why is that? The kind of content design I do is very closely aligned with engineering work, which naturally follows that we should be part of the PR flow. Another thing is that I think all of you have at some point in your past felt the pain of working with clumsy CMSs or even doing API docs in Word, which is obviously suboptimal. And given that content designers are PR reviewers, we contribute to more than just the documentation. We also take a look at endpoint names, etc., making sure that the whole thing, its information architecture, what we're trying to express, will make sense to the target audience. The final question people often ask about technical writing is whether we should have technical writers embedded in teams or helping different teams ad hoc. So in my opinion, the ideal approach would to always be embedded, but this is not really practical given that resources and companies are not infinite. The standards in industry for this vary. I've seen having as few as 5 to 6 developers per technical writer to as many as 50. We skew towards the latter. I support 6 development teams in my work, but thanks to solid process, we make it work fairly well. Moving on to the next point of the agenda, getting more specific, I'll be talking about how we write the stuff we write. The first point I'd like to highlight is that we use exactly the same tools as the engineers. I think a huge benefit of the Docs as Code approach in general is that it's tool agnostic. This means that whether you like working in Notepad or in something more advanced like Sublime, you're free to do so since the output is independent of the tools you use. Personally, I don't use anything especially fancy. I use iTerm for my terminal emulator on my Mac and VS Code for editing, which I think is a fairly standard combo. Plus, in addition to that, we use Git to store and version our docs. So obviously, anyone who has ever worked with Git knows that it can be cumbersome, especially for the unacquainted. But I think there are multiple benefits to using it over other solutions. So thing number one is that it ensures that the documentation writers and the engineers use the same workflow, which helps with alignment. Another thing that I think is very important is Git ensures that doc version is 100% always aligned with software version. So if everything lives in the same pull request and then ends up in the same release, there's no risk of docs being outdated or misaligned as a result of process error or someone overlooking something. As for the key criticism of Git, which I guess would be usability, I will say that it's fair, but on the other hand, it's fairly easy to learn the stuff you need for doc workflows, which is probably like 5 commands. And if you don't want to even go that far, there are plenty of GUIs you can use instead, like source tree from us or GitHub Desktop, which I think is pretty nice. So really no reason not to use Git, in my opinion. Second thing is if you don't want to use Git or VS Code and still use a Git-based workflow, we offer the option internally to our developers and designers to use inline editors in 2 flavors. So there's an inline editor built into Bitbucket where you can just plain text edit code. And we have recently released an internal WYSIWYG editor for DAC. So DAC stands for Docs Atlassian Com. Essentially, the way it works, you just click Edit on any Markdown-based page, edit it, click Save, and get sent to the pull request flow. Very simple and straightforward. Another important component of how we work with documentation is style and style guides. So the purpose of style guides is really obvious, I think. Number one is that it ensures a uniform personality across all of our content. The motto we have is to be practical with a wink, which means that we provide all the information you need without boring you to death. At least I like to think so. Another benefit of a uniform style is that we have the same vocabulary enforced across all of our documentation, or at least we try to, which naturally reduces confusion, helps people orient themselves. And finally, there's part of our style guide that refers to the language we use, specifically stuff that we have here to avoid giving offense, essentially. So using words like allow list instead of whitelist, etc. All this, I think, benefits the quality of our documentation. Finally, there's CRIT, which is an abbreviation of critique. You can think of documentation crit as a combination of code review and demos. Essentially, what it is a weekly or bi-weekly ritual, depending on how much stuff you produce, where content designers show what they've come up with to other content designers and other members of the org where they can get feedback on usability, on the content itself. It really helps us work collaboratively and keep the quality high. All right, now that we're done writing, let's move on to the next step in the workflow, which is previewing stuff. So we have the technology to do local builds and previews for all of our Git-based doc sets. Why do I say that it's for Git-based doc sets? Well, this is because not all of our documentation lives in Git. We have some stuff, for example, like SAC or support Atlassian COM that lives in Contentful. So obviously, local previews don't apply. You just get a web preview for that. Still, all of our developer-focused docs live in Git, and so naturally, all I'm going to say applies to all of our dev docs. Moving on to the next highlight of this section is the benefit of having a single command build process, meaning that for all docs that are part of the JIRA Java code base, you need to get through the build process to get a preview, since the documentation is embedded within the code. But running the build is very simple. Thanks to a bunch of automation, you essentially just input a single command and it gets you from Java comments via JSON to rendered HTML, which is very nice. Another benefit of the automation we have is that you do not need to rebuild the entire code base and compile everything every time. You can just build a part of it, namely, typically the part you've changed. The process is made even simpler for native Markdown docs where there is no build process. You just click Save and the changes are done immediately. So the final part is after you've built it, you can preview it. We have a dedicated CLI tool or command line tool for this, which we have inventively called Atlas. And within it, you can get a dedicated plugin for our docs, which is called DAC. I'm sure you remember the acronym. It stands for Developer Atlassian COM. So once you've gotten the plugin, you just run it in the folder in which the home directory of your repo. And what the plugin does, it runs a local web server. And using the local web server, you can preview your changes instantly and in exactly the same way that they are going to look on the web. And the nice thing for this is we have the same plugin, the same toolset, both for the Markdown documentation and for the Java code-based documentation, which needs to be built. Everything works with the DAC plugin to Atlas. All right, so now that you've written and previewed your stuff, it's time to get it reviewed. As I've mentioned earlier, doc reviews are 100% identical to PR reviews. That's the big message. As a bit of proof, you can see a screenshot of me working on a PR with Bob. Anyway, moving on. What even is the point of reviews? This might be obvious, but I think it's worth getting into for a second. First of all, everyone makes mistakes. This might be, it's just a fact of life, which, however, sometimes is overlooked when it comes to documentation. You would never push code to prod without tests, without reviews, etc. Why would you do this with documentation if you're treating it seriously? Obviously, you wouldn't, so we don't. The second assumption I'd like to talk about a bit is that no PR is ever considered done without documentation. I know I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. When your product is an API, the discoverability, the usability approach is zero when you have no documentation for it. So obviously documentation is important. This is also why developers are responsible for documenting everything they develop as they go. And this has the additional benefit of increased developer productivity. Why, you might ask? Well, in a big company, which we are, with employees across the world, time zones, etc., The cost of context switching can be hard, so multiple developers working on the same code base could easily become confused by what they see. Documentation helps alleviate that. The final point I have here is that content designers are approvers. So your PR will not get merged to master or main without content design approval. I'm not going to go over the reasons again. Let's just stress that documentation for APIs is important. What's the exact workflow for these reviews we do? Well, it's the same as for any PR. If the change is small and we don't think it merits a consultation, you just do a quick comment. If you think there is room for discussion, you just leave a comment on the PR page. And finally, what do we focus on when we do our reviews? There's a few key factors I always try to keep in mind. The first one is usefulness to the audience, obviously. So whether the document actually provides value or whether it just checks a box. The second thing is clarity. So very often people who don't think about documentation too much come up with stuff that can be confusing or even counterproductive when they write docs. We try to prevent that. Finally, we look at style guide compliance, so vocabulary, terminology, etc., making sure that everything is compliant with the style guide. And the final and least exciting part is obviously making sure that the formatting isn't broken once it gets built, so that everything looks professional and readable. All right, now that we're done with reviews, there's the part of announcing changes. So if you look at the slide, you can see a big question there. And the answer, I think, is fairly obvious. Docs are no good if people don't know they exist. So we do a few things to announce stuff, especially documentation, once it gets released. One big part is product change logs, which we are luckily able to do in a semi-automated manner in the cloud org. Naturally, it's based on JIRA. The way it works is you submit a ticket. One of the fields is the API group, another is the type of change. You put in a summary, a title, and once this goes through content design review, I flip it to the announced status and a bit of automation, publishes it on the web for everyone to see. Change logs for our server and DC products are done in a different manner, but let's just skip over that for now. The second thing is CDAC. You might have noticed that we like acronyms. Anyway, CDAC stands for Community Developer Atlassian Com. This is essentially an old-style forum that we use for announcements, for which we actively want to get feedback. So stuff that we really want our audience to engage with and discuss. And another purpose of CDAC is that it allows us to communicate with participants of early access programs or EAPs. So when we have an experimental API, a new endpoint, something that's not quite ready for global release, we release it to some select partners and admit them to a private CDAC forum where they can discuss, give us feedback, etc. The final thing is blogs and marketing communication. Luckily, I don't have to do a lot of that. The blogging part is pretty rare in our part of the organization, but when it is, it's usually stories of how our internal developers have worked with partner developers to achieve something. And this, when they do get done, they also go through content design review for all the reasons I've mentioned earlier. So style guide, accuracy, usefulness to the audience, etc. Okay. Now that we're done with this, on to the final part, which is addressing issues. Again, a big statement there on the slide, which I think is also a universal truth. Nothing's ever perfect. But you also should strive to improve the imperfections that you produce. Anyway, the ways we try to improve our docs are several. First is user feedback. So all of our docs have built-in facilities for collecting user feedback, thumbs up, thumbs down, comments, etc. All of this feedback gets saved, collect it and we see it in the JIRA project. So contrary to what some might think, it doesn't get thrown out. We actually do look at it, triage it, and then queue it for resolution. Which brings me to resolving the doc backlog. This is something our team has put a bunch of effort into in this quarter. The two contractors on my team have resolved, I think, upwards of 100 issues. And this have been small things like typos and code samples to big things like rewriting entire developer guides due to feedback. Right. The next thing we do to continuously improve our docs is content audits. If you haven't heard the term, this is like a small project that's run by a content designer as a part of a bigger initiative. So for example, if we're looking at the admin journey, we look at the documentation we have in place and run essentially what I think is a content version of gap analysis. And as a result of this, come up with a content plan and put new stuff in place to provide a better experience. And finally, there's research-based improvements. So we do continuously collect data via customer satisfaction surveys, via interviews, via a number of other avenues. And then we take that into account when we run improvements. One recent example I can think of when we used these findings to benefit the audience was when we rewrote the entire inline help we offer with our Forge CLI tool. I think it's much better now. All right, now, just before we finish, a quick look at the API doc lifecycle overview again. So before we conclude, I'd just like to leave you with like a headline of this entire thing, which is that APIs without docs, I think, provide very little, if not zero value to developers. I think that documentation deserves and should be treated as seriously as code. So, you never push to prod without testing and reviews. The same applies to documentation. We try to follow this at Atlassian since you can't really have a successful API ecosystem without good API docs. All right, that's it for me, or rather from me. We have a few minutes left for Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions you might. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.